feet of pay underneath that, right? And good stuff, like 2 ounce per 100 type stuff.
At the heart of the Yukon, a routine mining season was unfolding like any other. Crews pushed forward, machines roared, and expectations stayed fixed on gold. But beneath one claim, history refused to stay buried. What surfaced was not ore, but a truth powerful enough to shake a miner's past, collapse hard-earned trust, and alter the future of an entire operation. What followed was more than a discovery. It was a reckoning that would change Gold Rush forever. The Gold Rush world.
There is gold here, and it's just a matter of figuring out where. So, if I'm gonna be successful here, I better figure.
The Yukon sun hovered low above Duncan Creek, stretching long shadows across Rick Ness's mining operation. For weeks, the crew had been pushing harder than ever, cutting deeper into ground that had already fought them at every turn. Equipment breakdowns, rising personal strain, and shrinking gold totals had transformed what was meant to be a breakthrough season into an exhausting exercise in uncertainty. What should have felt like progress instead felt like survival. The wash plant had failed 3 times within as many weeks, draining precious hours and burning through thousands of dollars in repairs they could hardly afford. Fuel prices had climbed beyond all forecasts, slicing into margins that were already painfully thin. The bedrock they believed would finally reward their effort proved inconsistent and discouraging, offering just enough color to keep hope alive, but never enough to justify the punishing labor required. Still, none of that prepared them for what waited beneath 20 feet of frozen permafrost and debris left behind by miners long gone. When the excavator's bucket punched through a collapsed tunnel no one knew was there, the entire operation froze. The crack of splintering wood and falling earth echoed through the valley, followed by a heavy silence that drew every eye toward the machine. What surfaced was not gold, not promise, but something far more unsettling. They uncovered the remains of an old mining camp intentionally buried, along with documents and personal items that hinted at secrets far darker than anyone expected. Rusted tools, untouched by daylight for more than a century, lay among fire-scorched timbers. Personal effects, worn boots, dented tin cups, a harmonica locked in time, told the story of lives ended abruptly. Rick Ness stood at the edge of the dig, his color drained, realizing this discovery would force him to face truths about his claim, his operation, and himself. The crew gathered quietly, breath hanging in the cold air, knowing without speaking that they had crossed a point of no return. Younger miners exchanged uneasy looks, caught between curiosity and fear. Seasoned veterans, hardened by decades in the Yukon, stood stiff with expressions of genuine discomfort. This was no longer about gold. It was about history and the weight it carried. As Rick reached into the rubble and lifted a weathered photograph, his hands shaking despite years of hard labor, everyone knew what came next would redefine everything they believed about Gold Rush, mining in the Yukon, and Rick himself. The image showed a group of miners standing before a sluice box, their faces worn and somber, and etched into the wood, barely visible, was a name that would linger in Rick's mind for weeks to come. Rick Ness's quiet battle.
They didn't think I'd make it through my first season, but, I'm still here.
The reality of Rick Ness had always been more layered than what the cameras revealed during filming. Beneath the confident image of a mining boss who built his own operation from nothing lived a man struggling with pressures no amount of gold could silence. Those closest to him had noticed the shift over the past 2 seasons. The visible weight loss, the restless nights spent studying mining charts and legal paperwork, and the way his smile no longer carried the ease it once had. What viewers never saw were the panic episodes that struck in the solitude of his cabin, the prescription bottles kept out of sight in his truck, or the urgent late-night calls to attorneys and land surveyors that stretched well past midnight. Rick's rise from Parker Schnabel's trusted right hand to an independent mining leader had been celebrated as a gold rush triumph. He had shown he could manage his own crew, secure his own ground, and build a legacy in one of the harshest environments imaginable. But that success carried a toll few truly understood. The financial strain of operating a mine pushed him dangerously close to bankruptcy more than once. Equipment financing, payroll obligations, fuel expenses, and lease payments stacked relentlessly, making every ounce of gold vital. One failed season could erase everything he had built, a truth Rick knew deeply, the kind that keeps a man awake, staring into darkness, recalculating numbers that refuse to balance. Yet money was only part of what was wearing him down. Rick was also facing something far more personal, a health issue he chose to keep hidden from his crew, the production team, and millions of fans following his journey. The exhaustion attributed to long days and hard labor stemmed from something far more serious. Doctors' visits, tests, and treatment discussions filled his off-season, forcing him to confront mortality in ways that made mining dangers seem almost insignificant. He chose to keep moving forward, to film another season, to prove to himself he was not finished. That choice meant carrying fear, secrecy, and the constant awareness that his body might falter long before his determination did. Strains also formed within his personal life. Carla, who had stood by him through some of his darkest chapters, stepped back when the pressure became overwhelming. Their bond, once grounding and steady, became another casualty of Rick's relentless pursuit of success. Friends from his music days barely recognized him. The laid-back bass player who once lived for performance had become guarded and cautious, trusting few. Leadership brought isolation, and Rick carried it with the resolve of a man committed to seeing his path through to whatever end awaited him. Darker secrets.
Yeah, let me run that through my head for a bit here.
Duncan Creek had long carried a reputation as unforgiving ground among Yukon miners. The geology was complex, the gold uneven and unreliable, and the region's past was crowded with stories of operations that failed spectacularly. Local miners often spoke quietly about the creek's tendency to break even the most persistent prospectors, about seasons that began with optimism and collapsed into bankruptcy. Old-timers in Dawson City bars would lower their voices when Duncan Creek came up, shaking their heads as they told stories of machinery lost to unstable earth and partnerships torn apart by anger over yet another ruined season. What Rick Ness and his crew did not realize when they secured the lease was that this stretch of ground carried a history far darker than ordinary mining misfortune. Hidden inside land registry records and forgotten newspaper archives that no one had revisited were reports of disappearances, camps abandoned without warning, and disputes that escalated into violence before being quietly buried as the frontier shifted and new gold rushes stole attention. The collapsed tunnel system they uncovered was not merely outdated mining infrastructure. It pointed to an operation active in the early 1900s, a time when mining law belonged to whoever was strongest, and claim conflicts were settled with fists and far worse. Documents pulled from the debris told of claim jumping, of miners arriving at ground they believed was theirs, only to find others secretly extracting gold from concealed tunnels. The confrontations that followed were savage and final, and rather than involve distant authorities who might pry too deeply, those who survived buried the evidence and moved on. What made the discovery especially devastating for Rick was the realization that his claim, the ground he had invested everything in, rested directly atop this forgotten tragedy. Yukon mining regulations are strict and complex, and disturbing a historical site, even unknowingly, can trigger investigations that halt operations for months or permanently. Beyond the legal nightmare was something even more personal. Among the recovered items was a damaged journal listing names, and one of them was Ness. The possibility that Rick's own ancestors were connected to what happened here over a century earlier sparked a crisis that went far beyond finances. In the North, reputations echo across generations, and this kind of legacy could destroy everything he built. The ethical questions pressed heavily: report the truth and face the fallout, or rebury it and protect survival. He thought about families still waiting for answers, about truth buried beneath convenience, about a decision no amount of gold could ease, and the weight of it showed in every line of his face as he stood over that excavation site, knowing that whatever he decided in the next few hours would define him far more than any season's gold total ever could. Cracks within the crew.
Monster Red's sitting there, pile of dirt with a ton of gold in it, and we can't even run it.
The discovery at Duncan Creek did more than create challenges for Rick Ness. It revealed fractures within his crew that had been quietly forming for months. Mining crews often function like families, bonded through shared struggle and common purpose, yet vulnerable to the same tensions and divisions that can tear families apart. When pressure rises, stakes intensify, and resources feel limited, those hidden cracks tend to split wide open. The days following the excavation proved that even the most resilient teams have breaking points, and that loyalty can become the first casualty when individuals begin worrying about their own survival and futures. Tension surfaced quickly in subtle ways, whispered conversations near machinery, small groups forming and dispersing, voices falling silent the moment Rick approached. Some miners conducted their own research after seeing what had been uncovered, scrolling through old mining records and newspaper clippings during breaks. The deeper they dug into Duncan Creek's past, the more uneasy they felt about continuing work on land stained by violence and unexplained deaths. Superstition runs deep in mining culture, and disturbing ground where men had died under questionable circumstances was enough to rattle even the most practical minds. But fear was not driven by superstition alone. Several crew members began asking difficult questions about what Rick knew and when he knew it. Had he understood the claim's dark history before leasing it? Had he withheld information that might have influenced their decision to join? At first, the accusations remained unspoken, lingering like smoke and slowly corroding trust built over years. Rick found himself defending choices he never made and knowledge he never had, struggling to lead men who now wondered if he had guided them into something inescapable. The situation escalated when a senior operator, someone who had been with Rick from the start, quit without notice. His exit was loud, emotional, and full of accusations that Rick had endangered the crew by pushing forward on cursed ground. The confrontation unfolded in front of cameras documenting the season, capturing every heated word for an audience of millions. His final remarks cut deeply, implying secrecy and pressure had turned Rick into someone unrecognizable. In the aftermath, Rick faced a harsh truth about leadership and isolation. He had focused so intensely on protecting the crew from uncertainty that he had stopped truly communicating. Now, standing before those who remained, with cameras rolling and judgment looming, Rick had to find a way to rebuild trust that might already be beyond repair. The question wasn't just whether he could keep his operation running, it was whether he could keep his crew together long enough to matter. The revelation that altered everything.
Knew he wouldn't show. Sent some idiots who were bringing him forward. Knew it.
The pivotal moment arrived on a gray afternoon 3 weeks after the first discovery, when a group of archaeologists and mining historians came to Duncan Creek to evaluate the site. Rick chose to report what had been uncovered, prioritizing openness over self-preservation in a decision that surprised even those most critical of him. The investigation that followed was meticulous and relentless. Specialists carefully cataloged every artifact, every support beam in the collapsed tunnels, and every clue that could help explain what had happened here more than a century ago. What they uncovered reshaped not only the story of Rick's claim, but the broader understanding of mining history in the region. The breakthrough centered on a metal strongbox recovered from the deepest section of the tunnel network. Inside, sealed against moisture and decay, were documents that told a far different story than many had assumed. Conflict had occurred here. Miners had lost their lives under circumstances never properly examined, but the Ness name found in the damaged journal was not linked to the perpetrators. It belonged to a young miner who had tried to stop the violence, who recorded the crimes he witnessed, and who died attempting to alert authorities who might listen. Once preserved and translated, the journal revealed a man guided by conscience during a brutal era. For Rick, the discovery offered both relief and burden. His family name was cleared of the darkest accusations. Yet the responsibility his ancestor carried now transferred to him. Justice unfinished became his to complete. Plans emerged to preserve the site as protected history, with memorials ensuring those miners were remembered. That meant Rick's operation on this ground was over. The financial loss was devastating, and options were few. Still, part of Rick understood that integrity and profit do not always align, and character is proven by which path is chosen. Media attention intensified, praise and criticism colliding publicly, while Rick stayed quiet, absorbing what this meant for his future. The man who'd once been so confident in front of cameras now seemed diminished somehow, as if the weight of history and expectation had physically pressed him down into something smaller and more uncertain. What lies ahead for Rick Ness? The weeks after the revelation set off changes that spread through every corner of Rick Ness's life and career. The decision to halt mining at Duncan Creek was made together with the Yukon Territory's Heritage Department, and the process of shutting down the site responsibly while protecting its historical value quickly became a full-time responsibility. Rick now found himself working side by side with archaeologists and historians, helping to document and safeguard the very ground he once believed would secure his future. There was undeniable irony in spending his days preserving land he could no longer mine. Yet alongside that bitterness was an unexpected sense of purpose, a feeling that he was finishing the work his ancestor had begun, giving recognition to miners whose voices had been erased by violence and time. The financial consequences were immediate and severe. With no active mining, Rick had no income to offset the heavy debts accumulated over multiple seasons. Equipment loans came due without revenue to cover them. Crew members who stayed through the shutdown needed final payments he struggled to provide. The infrastructure he had built, offices, storage yards, maintenance agreements, became liabilities pulling him closer to bankruptcy. Legal advisors urged him to consider filing for protection, using the system to reorganize debts and preserve whatever remained. From a practical perspective, the advice made sense. Personally, it felt like surrender. Rick had built his identity around perseverance. Miners push through bad ground. They do not quit. But sometimes the ground never improves, and continuing only means digging deeper into collapse. The personal toll proved even harder to quantify. His relationship with Carla, already weakened by stress and distance, finally broke apart. She had tried to understand Rick's need to see this through, but sacrifice has limits. Their final conversation was quiet and definitive. No anger, no drama, just acceptance that some things cannot be saved. Rick absorbed the news alone, the only sign of its impact being a slight tremor in his hands as he poured coffee the next morning. Yet, amid financial loss and emotional fallout, something unexpected emerged. The story of what Rick uncovered and how he responded resonated far beyond gold totals. Messages arrived from Gold Rush viewers who saw his shutdown decision as proof of integrity. Historians and preservation advocates praised his cooperation. Media outlets outside the show's usual audience began covering the story as an intersection of modern mining and historical accountability. The attention was overwhelming and strangely hollow. Praise did not solve debt or rebuild a future. Gold Rush producers faced difficult conversations of their own. The show thrives on struggle, triumph, and comeback narratives. Duncan Creek offered none of that. There was no last-minute gold save, only consequence and restraint. Behind closed doors, discussions questioned Rick's future on the series, adding uncertainty to an already unstable moment. Through it all, Rick found clarity. The identity he built as a mining boss had been stripped away by forces beyond control. What remained was more enduring. He was still a musician, still someone who understood how to shape meaning from raw material. He still valued loyalty and leadership. Most importantly, he remained someone who would choose the right decision, even when it cost him everything. Conversations quietly surfaced about what comes next. Some suggested consulting work. Others saw opportunity in media or historical storytelling. His lawyer continued advocating bankruptcy as the only realistic financial option. Rick listened, reflecting rather than rushing forward. For once, stopping to think felt acceptable. Within the Yukon mining community, reactions were mixed. Some viewed Rick as a warning, others respected his resolve. Veteran miners understood the deeper truth. Mining is never just about gold. It is about balance between ambition and legacy, knowing when to push and when to stop. As winter closed in and mining ground hardened beneath frost, Rick stood once more at Duncan Creek. The site was now protected, documented, and sealed. Artifacts rested in museums. The story his ancestor tried to tell was finally heard more than a century later. Sometimes changing everything means losing everything first. Sometimes the gold you find isn't the gold you came looking for. Sometimes the story you end up telling isn't the one you thought you'd write, but it's yours nonetheless, and that has to be enough.
I mean, the pub's beautiful, but, you know, the fact that those guys drove it all the way here, and now they're going to stick around, help me get it set up, I mean, how the you ask for more than that?
What was uncovered didn't explode or collapse in an instant, but its impact was just as powerful. Some discoveries don't end a story, they redefine it. Rick Ness's journey is far from over, and what comes next will matter more than gold. Stay with us, subscribe, and keep watching.